Defining Intelligent Masculinity: Why Vagueness Protects Harm and Precision Demands Accountability, by Nick Perro on Sick of This Shit Publications. One of the most reliable ways fragile masculinity avoids accountability is by refusing to be given a definition. When masculinity is left vague, purposely reduced to feelings, instincts, dominance, or traditions, it becomes impossible to challenge. Harm hides inside these vague abstractions, while men are allowed to mindlessly gesticulate towards strength without ever naming what that strength actually requires of them. Vagueness does not then soften masculinity. It protects the worst expressions of it. Across the first 5 intelligent masculinity conversations, a clear understanding has emerged. When masculinity is left undefined, it always defaults to power without responsibility. It is clear that providing definition to masculinity is not merely a semantic exercise. It is a moral obligation. As Shane Yurick put it early in the series, masculinity cannot be allowed to float above consequence. He says, if masculinity can't be tied directly to consequences, then it's not worth talking about. His insistence sets the terms for a clear understanding. A masculinity that cannot be named precisely cannot be practiced intentionally. And a masculinity that cannot be practiced intentionally will always be an unprepared performance instead. This performance is where true harm hides. It is a mask accepted by these men as they allow others to assume the responsibility for consequences of their actions and values. Sherrod Swaney articulated this risk from a younger vantage point, naming how easily men adopt an identity before earning it. It's easy to say the right things and still avoid the hard ones, Sherrod says. That gap between language and behavior is where fragile masculinity thrives by allowing confidence and false bravado to replace coherent values, a false identity in the shape of a mask to replace discipline, and unwavering certainty replaces mindful reflection. Lawrence Winterman pushed our understanding further by rejecting the idea that masculinity needs rigid boundaries at all, without abandoning principles. His understanding is not anchored in false certainty, rather in anchored honesty. He says, authenticity isn't about knowing exactly who you are. It's about staying honest while you're still figuring it out. This is an important distinction when discussing the truth of intelligent masculinity. It is not rigid, and it certainly is not vague. It allows for uncertainty of thought without abandoning accountability. What intelligent masculinity refuses is mythology, the idea that we must always be defended, the victims, rather than something which needs to be examined. Walter Rhine named the cost of that mythology directly. Masculinity collapses when it requires other people to abandon reality on your behalf, Walter says. When masculinity depends on constant denials, denial of harm, denial of truth, denial of others' experiences, denial of consequence, it becomes as brittle as early spring's ice, filled with cracks just below the surface. Any simple challenge to our perceived authority becomes an attack, while accountability feels like humiliation and violent escalation replaces thoughtful reflection. This is why Walter places such emphasis on a definition grounded in repair rather than burdened by defensiveness. His model of masculinity is one of clarity, not ego. He says, an unqualified "I'm sorry" is one of the strongest things a man can say. That statement only makes sense if masculinity has been redefined away from dominance and instead aimed toward responsibility. In a vague, fragile masculine framework, an apology is made to feel like a weakness, whereas in a defined masculinity, that apology becomes an unqualified ownership for the consequences of our actions and values. Dr. Eric Lulov further pins down our definition to its most practical concept. regulation, and reflection. He says power without restraint is destruction. Eric consistently resists flashy, loud, or absolute definitions of masculinity. Instead, he frames it as an integration. Patient intellect over reactive impulse, and presence with purpose over performance. Eric says, strength is measured, it's not loud. This reframing matters because much of modern masculinity confuses intensity for authenticity. Rage is treated as honesty. Speed is treated as decisiveness. Control is treated as leadership. Pinning down a definition disrupts those substitutions. This is where Evan Fields comes in to complete the defining arc, forcing masculinity out of the internal and into the public. His contribution is a decisive one. Masculinity is not proven by what you believe, rather by what you participate in. Evan rejects masculinity as a private identity project altogether. Instead, he sees masculinity as civic. He stated, values create obligations, not identities. Evan's reframing removes the final escape hatch. If masculinity is something you are, it can easily remain untested. Whereas, if masculinity is something you do, it must survive friction, community, disagreement, risk, and consequence. Evan is explicit about the danger of intellectual detachment masquerading as wisdom, saying, cynicism is avoidance dressed as intelligence. Definition without participation is performance. Participation without accountability is chaos. Intelligent masculinity requires both, and our communities are where that balance is tested. This is taken a step further to include one of the most common masculine emotions, anger, and Evan made sure we understood the stakes around it. He says, anger can clarify injustice, but anger without direction becomes destructive. Contained, focused anger becomes a fuel for our moral energy. Uncontrolled, wild anger becomes an identity, and this identity becomes a mask, a flashpoint where accountability dissolves. Across all 5 conversations, a shared definition of intelligent masculinity begins to crystallize, not as a slogan, but as a set of commitments. Accountability over excuse, reflection over reflex, discipline over posture, relationship over hierarchy, and growth over myth. Or, as Shane Urich framed it more bluntly, if you don't stop and examine what you believe, you'll just become a vessel for whatever shaped you. That is the danger of vagueness. Undefined masculinity does not stay neutral. It absorbs whatever incentives surround it. Power, fear, ideology, and grievance rush in to fill the void. Adding clear definition by contrast creates friction, which forces men to ask not whether they feel strong, but how that strength is expressed and who bears the cost. This is why intelligent masculinity insists on language. Words matter because they set boundaries. They determine what is permitted, what is challenged, and what is owned. Masculinity that cannot be clearly named will always default to domination. Masculinity that can be clearly named must answer for itself. It is something we own. This was Defining Intelligent Masculinity by Nick Parrow on Sick of This Shit Publications. Thank you. Have a great day.